Well, it is noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so that means it is time for us to get started, no matter what time it is for you, depending on where you are in the world. So good afternoon, good morning, or even good evening. And it is a pleasure to welcome you today to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. My name is Nicole Bryant, and I'm the Managing Director here at the Program on Negotiation. And today we are delighted to be welcoming Stevenson Carlebach, who's going to be talking to us about overcoming resistance in negotiation. Today's participants are coming in from all over the world. Please do let us know where you're coming in from. We love to see you in the chat. I will say for our American contingent, happy post-Thanksgiving. We hope you had a wonderful and restful holiday. PON Live took a little break, but we assure you that we are now going forward with a sprint to the winter holidays. We've got 5 events coming up in the next couple of weeks. So your early New Year's gift is a whole bunch of wonderful speakers and negotiation learnings coming forward. So as usual, today's presentation will feature first a presentation by our invited speaker, Stevenson, for about 40 minutes. And after that time, there will be an opportunity for all of our guests to ask questions. We invite you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom that allows us to more easily respond to the questions that are coming in. Of course, if you have a comment at any time, you may put it in the chat. Special thanks, of course, to the PON team who put so much work into setting up today's event, especially Diane Long, James Kerwin, and Riley Schretzel. We appreciate all that you do and will be doing over the course of this next hour. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce Stevenson Carlebach, who is an affiliate faculty member with the Program on Negotiation, as well as an independent trainer and consultant. Stevenson has taught with PON for many years, and we're delighted to be featuring him in an upcoming virtual course, which will be happening early in 2023. Stevenson has advised both in the public and private sectors, and I know that you are going to get a lot out of his session today. So without further ado, I will pass off the virtual Zoom microphone to Stevenson Carlebach.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. Just checking, can you see my slides as they are intended? Nicole? Yes?
Yes, perfect. All good,
perfect.
Stevenson. You're ready to go.
Just want to double check. So thank you, Nicole, for the lovely introduction, and thanks all of you for joining today. Influence. It's something that, on the one hand, you're really good at a lot of the time. And then I'm guessing sometimes you, like me, we find ourselves hopelessly frustrated when we can't get through to the other person. So today I want to look at a couple of things. We don't have a lot of time, so I want to focus on first, what are some of the sort of instinctive mindsets and behaviors that humans do that tend to undermine our ability to influence? And I have to warn you, most of us can really easily see those in other people. I can't believe they're influencing so badly, but it can be much harder to see it in ourselves. I also want to share with you a simple model that I think helps diagnose what's blocking our influence, what's causing the resistance, and gives us some clues on how we can mitigate that resistance and sort of perform behaviors that are more effective. And I have a favor to ask of you. I'd love for you to, as you're listening, to sort of test these ideas against your own lived experience. And to that end, I'm going to ask you for a minute, just think of some of your influence challenges. Who haven't you gotten through to? What were they like? What did it look like? What was their resistance like? And it doesn't matter, obviously, whether it's work or personal or whatever. I'm just really interested in your reaction, and I think it'll be more interesting for you if you're sort of testing these ideas against your experience. There's a good chance that recently you've been in an argument with someone who had a different point of view from you. And statistically, we know it's extremely likely that you didn't change their mind. not only didn't you change their mind, but they left the argument angry and frustrated. But they were even more convinced after they heard all your wisdom that they were right. And also, again, we know this by statistics, it's likely that you felt the same way about them. Or for some of you, maybe you thought about having that influence conversation, but you figured the other person was impossibly, hopelessly wrong-minded. So you chose just to decide to forget it. It's useless. I have to say, that's why I've spent the past 12 years of my life trying to understand not only what are the behaviors that help change people's minds, that help influence, overcome resistance, but more importantly, maybe this is just me, but how do I get my brain to want to do those behaviors? I mean, how do we active listen when we don't want to hear what they're saying? And in a way, that's one of the central problems we have to deal with, which leads me to a challenge for you. For many of people in this Zoom, the holidays are coming up. Some holiday is coming up. And for some of us, that means that we have to spend the time at some party or gathering with those relatives whose views we can't stand. We, for the past 2 years, it's pretty easy to use COVID as an excuse not to invite them, but it's getting harder to do that. So I'm just curious if you can consider actually having an engaged conversation with them as you listen to this talk. We'll come back to this idea later. Let's talk definitions for a minute. Influence is what we do, hence the verb, to impact actions, behaviors, decisions, feelings, and attitudes of another person. Daniel O'Keefe is a professor of communication at Northwestern, defined influence as a successful effort at influencing another's mental state through communication in a circumstance in which the influencee has some measure of freedom. So by freedom, we mean without coercion. So I'm not sure if we think about Elon Musk's, some of his management moves, is that influence or coercion? I think maybe if you say you should agree with me or I'll fire you, I don't think that's influence. I think maybe that's coercion. But I'm going to try not to. I'm a little obsessed with his management these days, but I'm going to try not to go off on that tangent too much. But the work I'm sharing with you is kind of a subset of that idea of influence, because there's a ton of really good information out there, research on part of influence that's really messaging, marketing, and sales. And these tend to be one-off communications. Like if CDC wants to figure out how they can get more people to vaccinate, like how do we send a message that will increase the likelihood, right? They spent the last 2 years doing a lot of research on that. And there's a lot, if you do a literature search, you'll see that there's a lot of really good information on that. But over 30, it's daunting to say that, but 30 years of teaching, negotiation, difficult conversations, influence, I found that the influence challenges that most of my clients, friends struggle with are not sort of one-off messaging conversations. They're ongoing relationships, and sort of devices that might work in marketing don't seem appropriate. So Bob Cialdini, one of the ones he identifies, it's a really strong human tendency, is reciprocity. Salespeople know that if, like a car salesperson will know that if somebody comes into the shop, if they offer them a drink, it actually statistically improves the likelihood that that person will buy a car. But in long-term relationships, I worry a little bit about some of those devices. So, can you imagine with your partner saying, honey, here's a cup of tea, just the way you like it. Now, let's not go to your parents for the holidays this year. I don't know. Maybe it's just bad luck for me, but I've never had a partner that would respond particularly well to that tactic. Anyway, there's good news and bad news about influence. First, influence is a performance skill. It's what humans do to get what we want. It's why we communicate. And a lot of people say, it's probably the human species' number one aptitude that's allowed us to prosper. Two, and this is really interesting, there's a growing body of scientific research that shows that certain behaviors are really effective at changing minds, even minds that seem resolutely closed. And third, effective influence is really simple. Well, it's simple to understand. But the bad news is effective influence is actually difficult to do, especially if we have strong feelings, if we care about the outcome. Second bad news, I have more bad news than good news. I don't know why this is. Maybe I should cut one out. But anyway, knowing more, like having an awareness of what works, doesn't actually translate into doing better. Sort of conscious awareness and performance skills are quite different. Third, because we've all been communicating, influencing so long. I mean, the first time you cried for milk, it was your first influence challenge, and presumably you were successful. Because we do it so often, it's mostly unconscious. So it's really hard to be aware of what we're doing well and what we're doing poorly. And of course, that leads us to the last point, which is most of us have a fairly limited repertoire of skills. And when they don't work, we tend to just do them again, maybe louder. And so one of the things we want to look at today is can we broaden our repertoire? So I want to jump into looking at a typical persuasion dynamic. I often will begin an influence workshop by asking participants to work together to come up with a list of influence advice. And they always come up with really good advice. In fact, I very rarely, sometimes there's like an idea or two, I think that's rubbish, but mostly they're all good ideas. And typically it includes these four: ask questions, listen more than you speak, know what's important to the person you're influencing, and empathize with them, right? Always, like, that I'm sure if I asked you, you'd come up with that list. Maybe some more, but certainly those four. So then after we discuss the list, I say, okay, let's do a quick exercise. I call it the persuasion exercise. I put people in pairs, and one person is the persuader, one is the observer. And I ask the persuader, think of something they care about. I mean, it's important to them. And I say, okay, you're going to have 2 minutes to persuade the observer of whatever you think. All right, ready, go. 2 minutes later, we say stop. Usually the persuaders look somewhat pleased with themselves, or some people wish they had had more time. But then I ruin it by asking the observers this question: how many questions did the persuader ask you? And I get a lot of this. The really incredibly skillful people ask maybe 4, sometimes 5, never more than 5. Now, this is in 2 minutes. People on average make 20 statements, so that's a pretty small ratio. Now, what's going on there? I mean, it's so fascinating. They have just said how important it is to listen, ask questions, empathize. And then the first opportunity to influence, they don't take their own advice. And honestly, I think this is the human condition. I mean, in my experience, it's really common. It happens to all of us. I know many of my colleagues who teach this stuff, we find ourselves doing it. It's a sort of daunting problem. And I think it's because humans have this kind of default. We tend to think that influence has to do with overcoming a deficit in the influencee, right? If we know we're right, and if they see it differently, they must be missing something, right? They're missing information, maybe missing intelligence, maybe sanity, right? It's sort of the deficit model. So Jean Piaget, the great educator, talked about that in education, and he sort of lamented that educators often used what he called the empty vessel theory of education. And students are these empty vessels, and teachers have to just fill the empty vessel with all the knowledge of the teacher. It often looks something like this, right? Why I'm right, facts, leading questions, so you'll see what you're missing. The news source you're using is no good at all, or maybe how you're misguided. And that's really what, for most of us, is persuasion. Just a quick story. When I was a high school sophomore, so that's 10th grade, when about 15 years old, I played American football. It wasn't very good, but it was a small school, so I could make the team. And I was a receiver. So those are the people who run out, and then the quarterback throws the ball to them, and they're supposed to catch it and run forward. My quarterback was an annoyingly good athlete. He went on to college. He started in football at college. He was really good. And even more annoyingly, his name was the same as mine. His name was Steve. It was just embarrassing. What would happen is I would run out. He would throw these bullet passes at me. Now, I played in New England. It was usually really cold. It was before global warming really kicked in. And I would have cold hands, and this football would be icy. And as the ball was coming towards me, I'd watch the enemies coming in, wanting to throw my little body to the frozen ground. And, it's nerve-wracking. And the ball coming at me about 1,000,000 miles an hour, and, I dropped it often. And honestly, it was humiliating. So one day after a game, I went up to Steve and I said, Steve, I'm often open. There's nobody around me. If you could just throw the ball a little more softly, maybe with a little more arc, I probably could catch it more often, and we could score more touchdowns. And Steve said something that impressed me. Even then, he said, "No, my job is to throw the ball. Your job is to catch it." And I remember, even as a 15-year-old, thinking, this is going to make a good story, and thinking, like, you idiot, like, isn't our job to win the game? Like, aren't we on the same team? But this is actually, as I said before, it's a very common mindset, even as much as I want to make fun of my athletic classmate. My daughter, Katie, went to the BU School of Education, and she had a class teaching Piaget and all about interactive education, how to make education more interactive, get students involved. And guess what? It was a lecture course. She told me the other day, she was so mad that it was so hypocritical that she didn't think she learned anything from it. So what's missing in this deficit mindset, right? It's obvious, right? It's them, their thinking, their feelings, why they see it differently. In the deficit model, we tend to focus on what's in our head, our ideas. How do I get my ideas to you? And we spend very little of our cognitive effort on understanding, what would allow them to catch the ball. So what's stopping persuasion? It's resistance, right? The empty vessel model doesn't work if the vessel is full. Throwing the ball doesn't work if you're throwing it in a way they can't catch. So I have to tell you the embarrassing ending to the quarterback story. I used to love telling this story in workshops, partly because, it seems a good example, a good metaphor for the way we often talk to other people. But one workshop, during a break, a participant came up to me and sort of pulled me aside, said somewhat quietly, I think he must have been a therapist. He said, Stevenson, I loved your story about the quarterback, but I have a question. How did you make your request of your quarterback? Like, what was your manner, your attitude? And I had this terrible moment when I realized, like, I thought he was being a total idiot for throwing the ball so hard every time. I thought he did this to look good and he didn't care whether I caught it. And I'm sure my attitude towards him leaked out in the way I made the request. But all this time, I thought the problem was the deficit in my dumb quarterback. I don't think he was dumb, but that's how I thought of him. And I was oblivious to the fact that the way I was throwing the ball made it impossible for him to catch it. So, look, we need a better model. If our brain naturally wants to go into the throw the ball model, how do we need a mind hack to shift our perception. So I want to share with you this simple concept and get your reaction. Persuasion equals my persuasion over their resistance, right? So think of it, we have two levers for influence. We can increase our persuasiveness, or you can reduce their resistance. If you watch people in a conversation where they're trying to influence, when they meet resistance, the typical response is to, say it again better. Let me add some, scientific evidence. Let me use simpler words, because if you weren't such an idiot, you would have understood it in the first place. It's this like, let me improve the numerator. Sorry, I had a little trouble with my math names there for a minute. But what's the most efficient way to increase our influence? It's to decrease their resistance. And this is obvious. You know the answer to this. How do we do it? Well, we have to figure out what's causing the resistance. And how do we do that? Well, of course, we ask questions, we listen, we engage, we stop talking so much, we stop explaining, we stop lecturing, and we engage with them. Okay, you have resistance. Makes sense. I'm a skeptic too sometimes. What's your resistance? Let me see if we can figure out what it is. So here's the simplest version of this. And part of the design is to make something really simple, because often when we're influencing, these are high stakes. Our emotions are involved, and you don't want to have a lot of complicated influence theory. You want to have a very simple idea, okay? So P's not getting through. Okay, what's the R? Okay, wait, I got ahead of myself there in slides. So I want to shift our focus for a minute from that of the influencer to that of the influencee. So in order to do that, I want you to think of a time recently when someone was unsuccessful at persuading you, right? You were skeptical, you were resistant. Got an example? Anything? The next question is, why weren't you persuaded? Can you think of what about their influence wasn't persuasive? Feel free to put it in chat. By the way, I'm not looking at chat because I feel like I'll get sidetracked, but I'm really looking forward to seeing it later. And I know the team is going to be looking and answering and engaging, so that's great. But don't feel ignored by me, please. I think you'll find that resistance is caused by one or more of three factors, which are reasoning. Actually, I should do an order of the slide. Interests, reasoning, or relationship. By interests, we mean needs, wants, or concerns, right? What's persuasive? Showing me how your proposal will meet my interest. What creates resistance? Either if significant interests aren't being met by your proposal, or maybe I have an alternative that I believe will meet my interest better than what you're proposing. Second, reasoning. By reasoning, we mean how people make sense of information. So what's persuasive is what's logical to them. Doesn't matter if it's crazy to you. If it's logical to them, it's going to be persuasive to them. What creates resistance is what's illogical to them. And by relationship, we mean really personal trust. What's persuasive is I trust that you're on my side. But if I see you as an adversary, if I feel like you have negative intentions in some way, it's better to resist. you could be making perfect logical sense, but if I think you're making really good arguments just to get the better of me, of course I'm gonna resist. So just back to, I asked you to think about a time you resisted. Does one of these factors feel particularly salient, like what was stopping the other person from saying yes? So just to be clear, in the time that's remaining, I'm going to be focusing on one of the factors. I'm going to focus on reasoning. I think each of the factors is important. They work together as a powerful diagnostic. And each factor acts as a kind of mini brain hack that helps us manage our own reactivity and helps us avoid doing stupid things that will increase their resistance. But today, there isn't time to cover all three, and I want to focus on reasoning. And in part, I think that's because of the state of the world. So in August, the Pew Foundation released a study that said since 2016, there's been a growing number of people in each American political party who simply do not like people in the other party. They see people in that party as people with differing views as being closed-minded, dishonest, unintelligent, and immoral. Now, I know this is a particularly difficult problem in the US, but for those of you who live in other countries, I think it's this sense of animosity seems to be growing in the world. So let's look at that a little bit. So let me just do a quick checkpoint where we are so far. Couple of things to think about. One, I think we always have to manage the human mindset that says the problem of their resistance is something missing in them. Two, we need to step to their side and try to understand why their resistance makes sense to them. And three, once we understand, to diagnose which factors are triggering the resistance so we can manage that a little better. Okay, so let's jump into reasoning. So the simple factor is what's persuasive, what logical to them, and what causes resistance is narratives that challenges their truths, right? What seems illogical to them. Of course, the brain hack here is that if you're going to influence them, you're not going to just tell them all your ideas, but you need to try to unpack their thinking to find out what would make sense to them, what would be convincing. Now, I call this reasoning, but I think it's worth taking a minute here. My colleague and friend, Doug Stone, I don't know if you're here. If you are, hi, Doug. He co-wrote Difficult Conversations. Thanks for the feedback. If you don't know those books, they're fabulous and you should get them. He thinks reasoning isn't an accurate term for what humans do. He likes the term narrative because really we tell stories about why we're right. And I absolutely agree. I think he's right. We're going to talk about that more later. But he wasn't able to influence me on this point. I was resistant. And the reason I was resistant is because I think we think of it, if we're influencing, we think of it as a problem of reasoning. So that label works for us. When you ask people if they're frustrated not getting through to people, they often will say something like, why don't they listen to reason? But I want to look at the problem in a slightly different way. So have a look at this. You may remember that a few years ago, this image of this dress was passed around on social media and people squabbled about what color it is. So I just want you to register for yourself. What color do you see? It's probably either blue and black or white and gold. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this later, but I just wanted to sort of plant this seed. In order to talk a little bit more about reasoning, it's worth asking, why do humans reason? Like, what is reasoning for? Why did we evolve this specialized form of communication? Hugo Mercer and Dan Sperber examined how and why humans reason in a book called The Enigma of Reasoning. I think it's a really interesting book, The Enigma of Reason. According to them, we make a false assumption about reasoning. I know I do. When I read this, I was like, yeah, I do make that assumption. We think that the job of reasoning is to help individuals achieve greater knowledge and to problem solve, right? Isn't that what they say? But they said this thing, I'm going to read it to you. I think it's really interesting. Experiment and after experiment has convinced psychologists and philosophers that people make egregious mistakes in reasoning. It's not just that people, humans, reason poorly, it's that they're also systematically biased. I think that's fascinating. Instead, they say humans give reasons in order to explain and justify themselves to others, right? To indicate what motivates and in their eyes justifies their ideas and actions. And also to let other people know what they expect of them and to implicitly indicate what they expect of others. So in other words, we reason not to problem solve, but as a means of social connection. So leads me to this. It turns out, I find this distressing. I don't know if it distresses you. You know, when somebody says something that I think is wrong, I want to tell them the facts, right? I don't know if you do as well, but there's a lot of study that says facts simply don't change minds. And for the past 50 years, experiments have shown that they tend to actually backfire and actually enforce our original conclusion. So a woman named Elizabeth Kolbert wrote an article in the New Yorker called Why Facts Don't Change Our Minds. You can Google it, and it's pretty fascinating. And she described a number of studies, but one I'm going to talk to you about today. It was done at Stanford University. And I'll just quickly read it to you. For this experiment, researchers rounded up a group of students who had opposing opinions about capital punishment. Half were in favor and thought that it deterred crime, and the other half were against it and thought that it had no effect on crime. And the students were asked to respond to two studies. One provided data in support of the deterrence argument, and the other, right? And both studies, you can imagine, were made up, but were designed to be equally compelling in the statistics that they showed. So what do you think happened, right? The students who had originally supported capital punishment rated the pro-deterrence articles as highly credible and the others as not believable at all, and vice versa. And what's fascinating is at the end of the study, those who started out pro-capital punishment were now even more in favor of it, and those who opposed it were even more hostile. And as I've said, like this turned out to be true over and over. Psychologists call it the backfire effect. So if facts don't change minds, what does? So a quick story. Years ago, I was on a short flight as a consultant. You know, I spent a lot of time on planes going from one gig to another. And I found myself sitting next to a talkative guy, I'll call Bill. And at a certain point, he turned to me and made a comment. He was reading the newspaper. These people. I had this immediate reaction. It was clear to me that this guy was diametrically opposed to my views. And I felt myself to go into fight or flight. I wanted to either tell him what a jerk he was or just put on my headphones and ignore him. By the way, I'm not going to tell you what my views, my political views are, out of concern that if you have Bill's views, you will then think that everything I have to say about influence is rubbish. So we're just not going to talk about my views. But here's the thing. I had just come from teaching a course on how to have difficult conversations. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Doug. And one of the exercises was something we called hot buttons exercise. It's one of my favorite exercises. It's really fascinating. There's a couple of roles. One person is the inquirer, and their job is to only ask curious questions. But what makes this challenging is they're supposed to choose a topic that they care about, right? That they have strong feelings about. And a second participant will play the speaker, and they will advocate the opposite view of that of the inquirer. So in the face of somebody saying things you disagree with, you're supposed to ask curious questions. So I want to be really clear about this. We often talk about open and closed questions, but I think this distinction is really powerful. You can categorize questions by purpose. And there's two typical purposes that we ask questions for. One is to teach, to prove, to trap, right? I'm going to ask you a question to try to get you to see something, to see my point of view, to kind of lure you across. I call those advocacy questions. They're really designed to advocate my point of view in a kind of roundabout way. There's another purpose that we ask questions for. We ask questions to learn, to understand, to unpack, really just to be curious. I have no purpose to change your mind. I just want to understand what your mind is. And for this exercise, we call that inquiry. I like to just call inquiry only that kind of question. And so we had just done this exercise, and here I'm sitting next to this guy on the plane who's spouting all this, what I think is nonsense. And I've just watched people struggle to inquire because our brain keeps hijacking our purpose because we really want to prove them wrong. So I say to myself, okay, Steve, why don't you see if you can put your money where your mouth is, see if you can do it. So for the next 45 minutes of this flight, I decided I'm going to ask Bill curious questions. Try not to change his mind. I'm not pretending to agree with him. I'm just focusing on understanding his beliefs. So I did this for about 45 minutes. I learned a lot about him. He's not the monster that I thought he was a few moments ago. And then over the intercom, I hear them announce that we're going to be landing in 10 minutes. So I decided, okay, it's time. It's fair to advocate. So I make a couple of what I think are fair points, give him some information I think maybe he didn't have in favor of my beliefs. And here's what was amazing to me. Bill turns to me and goes, Stevenson, you had just about changed my mind. But now that I hear you talk, I realize you're completely wrong. It was so amazing to me. Just asking curious questions had just about changed his mind by giving him some reasonable information backfired. So if facts don't change mind, what does? So David McRaney is a really fascinating author. He wrote 2 books on cognitive biases and logical fallacies, right? And sort of how the brain works. And he was convinced that on these kinds of polarizing topics like politics or religion, people don't change their minds. Like once their minds are set, that's it. But guess what? He changed his mind. Even though we live in a time of hyperpolarization, we've seen some dramatic shifts in public opinion. So one example is gay marriage. So in his book, How Minds Change, he talks about a technique called deep canvassing, developed by a group called LAB, Learn, Act, Build, which is the political action arm of the LA LGBT Center. And their mission was to develop best practices for shifting public opinion. So for years, they've gone door to door to talk to people about issues. And if possible, they ask if they can record or videotape them, and then they bring them back and look at them. And they tried making logical arguments, like what are the most compelling arguments we could make? But according to Dave, the head of the lab, there was no end to the rationalizations that people made in the face of the best arguments they could come up with, justification, explanations, and ways to maintain their views were endless. They said it was like they spawned like the heads of a hydra. So they wanted to figure out what was work. And so they developed this technique called deep canvassing. And they wanted to avoid the endless arguments. So they practiced a different technique. Nod and listen, make the person feel heard and respected, and work to discover the motivations behind them. And this is a direct quote. Once people see where their ideas come from, they become aware that they come from somewhere. They can ask themselves, have I learned anything new since I last considered, since I last made up my mind? Are there any unresolved contradictions? In other words, people persuade themselves if you simply allow them to think about their thinking. Okay, I want to keep moving here. I want to share with you another research that I think is really interesting. And it's about receptivity. Julia Minson, she's at the Kennedy School of Government. She has the Minson Conflict and Collaboration Lab, and she studied what increased receptivity. And her lab has developed some techniques that studies show are quite effective at opening people's minds or increasing their receptivity. Her technique has 4 skills. Let me throw them at you. One is hedging. Hedging is using conditional words, like sometimes, perhaps. Instead of saying, here's the truth, you say, here's how I see it differently. The second one is emphasize agreement. So instead of saying, you people who don't wear masks have been causing all this illness, you say, wow, it's been tough for all of us to figure out what to do about this virus. 3, you acknowledge what they're saying. You check your understanding. So do I understand you? Is this what you said? Is this what you meant? And lastly, you reframe to the positive. So instead of like, I hate it when people interrupt me, you reframe that to, you love it when people let you finish. They looked at this and they wondered, as I'm imagining you do, I certainly do when I look at it, but that seems sort of weak and not very confident. And they wondered if just active listening and weakening your own views by hedging would sort of undermine our influence. But it turns out to be just the opposite. Simply practicing those 4 skills moved the needle. The influencee became more receptive to the influencer's perceptions. It's not easy to do because our brain wants to argue. And let me give you a story. I'm going to wrap up soon, but I want to tell you this story. Julia Minson tells a story. Apparently, she and her husband have an ongoing disagreement. Periodically, he feels underappreciated at work. And so he announces to Julia that for the next few months, he's going to work overtime so that he'll be seen in a better light and get the promotion he deserves. And this annoys Julia because, 1, she doesn't believe the company he works for will ever appreciate him. 2, if he's working all the time, that means there's more work for her to do at the home and raising the kids. And 3, because she's a negotiation expert and he hasn't asked her what she thinks he should do. So one week, I love this story. Julia, thank you for this. Julia spent 40 hours, so 8 hours a day for 5 days, taking a mediation class. And one of the skills they repeatedly practiced, the listening triangle, is very similar to the HER technique that she developed. So she got home after practicing these skills for a week, and her husband handed her a drink and said, Julia, for the next few months, I'm going to work overtime to make sure I'm seen and appreciated at work. And what did Julia do? The listening triangle? No. HER? No. She told him he was wrong. That wouldn't work. And she told him what he should do. And of course, he got upset, and so did she. And as they sat there in icy silence, after about 30 minutes, she thought back to what she'd been doing this entire week. And she wondered why she didn't use the skills she knew were effective. And as she tells it, she was still upset, so she had to fake it for a bit. But gradually, she asked better questions and then follow-up questions. And gradually, both calmed down. And after a long time, Ryan finally asked her what she thought he should do. All right, so I'm gonna go to checkpoint. I want to check in with you. So a couple things to remember: facts don't change mind. In fact, information, even evidence-based information, factual information that's contrary to someone's belief tends to increase their resistance. Two, what is shown to be effective is a mix of asking curious questions and acknowledging the influencing perspective. We don't have to agree with it. We just have to show that we've heard it. And also keep in mind, changing minds is a long game. Now, I'm just going to quickly point out the other two factors of resistance, right? Interest met over unmet interests. Resistance comes from they have important interests that your proposal hasn't addressed. They think they have an alternative that meets their interests better. Of course, the mind hack here is if you're not getting through to them, it probably means they have some interests that you haven't addressed. And that helps us get curious about what those are. And then the last, and sometimes the most complex of the factors is relationship. Trust over distrust. What creates resistance? If they distrust each other. Humans infer intention from the other's reasoning. So it makes sense that we would perceive people with other views as adversaries whose influence we shouldn't trust. What will my brother think of me if I listen to you and consider the thought of somebody from that political party? So central to relationship factor is emotions. It's a big subject. I don't have time to go over that, but trust and distrust are basically emotional reactions. And I would argue that influence, persuasion, essentially is an emotional game. If we trigger negative emotions, that will trigger resistance. If we trigger positive emotions, it will trigger more, it will lower the resistance. So quickly, what color is the dress? Pascal Wallish is a neuroscientist at NYU, and he became fascinated with this problem of perception. So he did a lot of research. It turns out, I didn't realize it was this bad, but it turns out that the human brain applies 30 visual filters. Basically, it photoshops with 30 different devices before it delivers an image to our consciousness, which we perceive as reality. We're completely unaware of all those filters. So after 2 years of research and more than 10,000 participants, Pascal was able to see a clear pattern. It turns out that people's prior visual experiences predict how their brain will interpret the dress, the colors of the dress. And the more time people were exposed to artificial light, which is more yellow, the more likely they'll see the dress as black and blue. And the more their brain was exposed to natural light, the more likely they'll see it as gold and violet. So the important idea here is our brains are not aware of this ambiguity. We only experience the output of all these filtering processes. And that's why we argue on the internet. So maybe I'll wrap with the following. Let me go back to Julia Minson for a minute. She's the woman at Kennedy School who described the great argument with her husband, Ryan. She was talking about how people tend to see influence as an unpleasant activity. If we're in an argument, we don't like it, we want to end it. And we tend to try to finish it as quickly as possible. She says, people are so busy persuading the other that they don't think about the next conversation. Every conversation is just a lead up to the next one. So this holiday season, when that relative or friend or in-law whose views you detest, when they make their snide little ignorant comment, and you're tempted to either point out what a jerk they are, in which case you'll get in trouble for blowing up the party. Everyone will say, why did you go there? Why didn't you just leave it alone? Or alternatively, what do? My move is to like get up and get busy doing dishes so I can just ignore that person. Instead, why don't you see if you can change their mind by not changing their mind? Instead, just ask a bunch of curious questions, demonstrate that you're listening and engaging with their point of view. See if you can't learn something new about the topic that you didn't realize, and see what happens to their certainty and maybe to yours. All right, I'm going to stop there. We have about 10 minutes. I want to thank the team at PON for all their help. Amazing work, as Nicole said, amazing group of people. And now, what questions do you have? Or maybe I should ask, what's your resistance to the influence equation? Let's see if I can put it here. Okay.
Well, thank you, Stevenson. This is so great. And I am glad that we're going to have some time for questions. But really appreciate this presentation. And I know that our 350 plus participants do too, because we've gotten so many requests for your slides. So everyone, we will be putting the recording up in a couple of days. You'll be able to view these slides at your leisure. Again and again, share them with others or direct others here. So the first question, Stevenson, that I'd like to pose comes from Claudia. And I think it's great, which is, what makes a curious question, right? How do you know if you're asking a good, curious question so that you're set on the right path there?
Claudia, that's such a great question. It's really hard. I'm going to sort of answer that indirectly. In the hot buttons exercise, very often the inquirer will ask a question and then the coach will go like, no, that wasn't curious. And they'll go, yes, it was. And then the coach will say something like, well, what was your purpose? And the inquirer will say, well, I just wanted them to see. Oh, right. So it's hard to tell because our brain literally gets hijacked. I mean, many times if you're doing that exercise, the person who's playing the speaker has already said to you, oh, it's going to be hard to take that point of view because I actually agree with you. And yet 3 statements in, you're like jumping down their throat and not even aware that you're doing it. So I think the question to ask is, what's my purpose? What am I asking this for? Is it to learn? Is it to understand? Or is it somehow to bring them over to my side? And I believe it's a skill we can get better at. And, I've been doing this for a lot of years. And believe me, I struggle a lot of the time. Hope that was helpful.
As we all do. So thank you very much for that, Stevenson. We have a question from Paula who wanted to get more information about the listening triangle.
Oh, great. This is something, I think Moshe Cohen developed this. He's got a book called Collywobbles, which is sort of focused on negotiation for people who are intimidated by negotiation. But it's basically a 3-step process that he works on, where the first step is ask, and you want to ask curious questions, short questions. The second step is listen, and you want to listen for their interests, what's important to them. Remember, this is for mediators. So of course, understanding the underlying interests of the parties is really key. And you want to make space for them to think, right? So and then the third part is to acknowledge or really reframe. So if they say, let's say it's let's see if I can use an example. If you're mediating a custody case, and the mother says, we have to split the custody every week. Well, each week we each get half. The reframe would be, so it sounds like it's really important that each of you get a fair amount of time with the kids. So I reframed from it has to be 3 days and 4 days to fairness. Or you could reframe to, it sounds like it's really important that you get to see the kids fairly often. Is that right? So reframing is a kind of a question that helps them shift from thinking about their position or the thing they want to why they want it. And once we get the interest, the underlying interest, it's much easier to come up with solutions. And in fact, good mediators will often, once they get the interest on the table, the parties can often solve the problem by coming up with creative options. But when it's positions, husband says, we're going to, do every other week. Wife says, no, we're going to split each week. Well, you can come up with 100 different ways to split the days, but neither one's going to be happy as long as they're talking positions.
Great. Thank you, Stevenson. We have a question about how to be successful at influencing when somebody continually moves the goalpost in negotiations. And is there a way to make sure that you are, getting the best outcome when that outcome keeps kind of changing?
Yeah. So, that sort of moving the goalpost strikes me as sort of potentially it could be a difficult tactic. And so one way of dealing with the difficult tactics is just sort of name the dynamic and sort of negotiate the process. So, it's happened a couple of times now where I felt like I had made a proposal that would meet your concerns, and then new concerns have come up. My concern is, well, for one thing, of course, I could do that same process. I don't think you'd be happy with it. And I'm afraid that if we get caught in that, we'll actually lose opportunity to create even more value. So can you help me understand what's going on and make sure, because otherwise my only course of action is to simply say, this is it, I'm not going to budge. And no matter what more things you add. And my concern about doing that is there may be really creative options we might be able to come up with that would create more value for you and more value for me. But if I'm just having to go, okay, no, last offer, we're not able to do that. So it's something about talking about the process. I don't know how that sounded to you, but the trick is to do it in a way that doesn't sound insulting or like you're putting the other person down for using dirty tricks, but just recognize, they're doing what they know to do to try to get their needs met, just as we are. And so we're going to try to talk about a process that will get both of our needs met better.
Great, thanks. All right, this is going to be our last question, which is, Stevenson, influence versus manipulation. Where is that line and how do you define it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you could think of any communication as trying to impact the other person as a way to manipulate them. But the way I think of it is manipulation is when we are using unconscious tools to get them to say yes, that they're not consciously deciding what's best for them. We're using some trick that's going to lure them into saying yes. Black Friday is a good example of that. You have 24 hours, rush to Walmart and find those specials, right? They're using time limitation as a way to manipulate you to want to go there. Okay, lower prices help, but a lot of it is this time limitation. I think what I would say is the best, if you care about the relationship, if you care about the relationship, the more conscious the person can be in deciding whether to take your advice or not, the better that is for the relationship long term. But if you're using kind of tricks or devices that are unconsciously affecting them, that's going to lean towards a manipulation. I talked about Bob Cialdini wrote a book on persuasion, and in persuasion, he talks about the dilemma of using those kinds of devices and how it moves you into a kind of ethical gray area. Okay, I think I took too much time in that. I hope that answer was helpful.
No, Stevenson, what the truth is that we just need another hour or another day. So as I mentioned in the chat, Stevenson will be back for an entire day on this very topic for a virtual class in February. And we are delighted to have him. He taught this last year to resounding acclaim. So we're delighted to have him on our virtual Zoom classroom coming up on February 23rd. And there are a variety of classes and events that will be presented with PON coming soon. Stevenson mentioned some of our other PON faculty. So Sheila Heen and Doug Stone are teaching live in person in Cambridge. And Sheila, I know, is on this webinar. So hi, Sheila, we will see you in person next week on difficult conversations. But also Julia Minson, who's going to be teaching a virtual class with us in May. In a more immediate sense, for other 1 hour PON live events, we have got a whole host of them coming up from now until a holiday break. So we are really looking forward to seeing you then. Stevenson, thank you again for all your time today. Thank you to all our participants for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you very, very soon. Thank you and be well.